You are now listening to Macrodose.
Hello and welcome to Macrodose, a podcast hosted by me, James Meadway, that brings you your weekly fix of everything economics in a quick 15-minute roundup. In today's episode, we'll be looking at, first, the cost of extreme heat and how political leaders need to grapple with it. Second, Andy Burnham's speech laying out his economic vision. And third, the Strait of Hormuz is reopening, but the impacts are still to come. Our first story this week picks up on the economic costs of the last heatwave, ahead of the next one, forecast for this weekend and expected to be less severe but more widespread across Europe. The human cost of these heatwaves is catastrophic. The World Health Organization has reported more than 1,300 deaths across Europe from the extreme heat. We also know that longer-term health conditions are exacerbated by the heat, and of course, on this continent, we don't live in towns and cities that are adapted to recurring temperatures of this kind. But there are broader society-wide costs too. Insurance firm Allianz obviously have a close interest in understanding the economic costs of extreme weather. Their economist modelling suggests that, as temperatures rise, workers become less productive, whilst energy costs increase as companies and households try to use more air conditioning and fans. For every 1 degree above average temperatures in Europe, they reckon output per hour falls by about 3%. With some days hitting 40 degrees or more last week, the losses will be severe. Profits for firms are squeezed first, and as they get less out of their workers, but in the alliance model, wages fall soon after. And the losses add up. Repeated heatwaves cause successively bigger and bigger squeezes on economic growth. Their estimate for the remainder of this decade, assuming each year sees successively worse heatwaves, is that losses from extreme heat across Europe will come to about 5 to 7% of GDP, or, in money terms, I quote, $240 billion for France, $345 billion for Japan, $147 billion for Italy, $131 billion for Germany, and $120 billion for Spain. But Allianz also reckon the longer-term losses are even bigger, since with reduced GDP and reduced productivity, firms are less likely to invest, and so growth in the future falls even further. For countries already heavily indebted, the result is a worsening of their fiscal positions, as falling tax revenues from lower growth meet rising demands for healthcare. Repeated heatwaves, in addition to lower growth, run the risk of government fiscal crises across Europe by the end of the decade. That's exactly a central contention of this podcast, that as climate change and nature crises begin to bite, growth will become harder and harder to come by, and bring with it a reshaping of how economies function on the most basic level. As Allianz say, we can opt to do something about this, shifting our policies to preventing losses rather than compensating for them, in their words. They conclude by presenting a strikingly comprehensive package of reforms for extreme heat, looking well beyond where even most political parties in Europe have got to. They say this: a workable occupational regime needs binding temperature thresholds, automatic work restrictions when those thresholds are crossed, paid compensation for lost hours, and coverage that reaches fixed-term, seasonal, and platform workers. No major European economy has all four, and the gap is concentrated on the last. Protections were designed around standard contracts and leave the workers most exposed to heat largely outside the regime. Prevention itself is also underused, with shifted hours, partial mechanization, and indoor cooling still rare. For buildings, 4 pieces have to fit together. Overheating standards in new construction, mandatory passive cooling in renovation, cooling access for vulnerable households as a social entitlement, and grid adequacy planning that accounts for coincident summer cooling demand and the thermal derating of generators. If that's how an insurance company is now thinking about coping with our warming world, it's high time our political leaders and political parties stepped up. Our second story this week is the big speech by Prime Minister in Waiting, Andy Burnham. There's a great deal in what he said that can and should be welcomed, as there has been in much of what Burnham has talked about in the last few weeks and months. The failures of privatisation and market control, the failure of austerity, the lack of investment across much of the country, and the centralisation of power in Whitehall, and in particular the Treasury. Burnham has a solid account of what has gone wrong with this country's economy over the last few decades, and if a lot of it will be familiar to some listeners, that's a tribute to the fact that the progressive critique of British capitalism has steadily been mainstreamed. It's not unusual anymore to hear the Treasury attacked for its excessive power and narrow vision, or to find the privatisation of essential services like transport and water criticised. Low investment is increasingly understood as the biggest single factor in Britain's miserable recent economic performance relative to other similar economies. The short story is that investment has fallen, and as a result, growth has lagged even behind other slowing economies. That, in turn, has meant lower household incomes and worsening exposures to various forms of economic shock over the last decade or so. Hefty economic shocks like the 2008 financial crisis, Brexit, and the period of instability since the 2020 pandemic have only accelerated the spiral. Britain today has significant government debt and a wide deficit, low growth, and substantial dependencies on the rest of the world in the form of its food and energy imports. So, whilst governments everywhere are finding it more expensive to borrow since the pandemic, the UK government's cost of borrowing has risen by more than most, and every year over £110 billion is now spent on interest payments, about the same, for comparison, as the entire education budget. Breaking this will require a hard break with the institutions that got us into this mess in the first place. That's where Burnham's criticism of Whitehall centralisation and the Treasury's role come in. And broadly, he is correct. A failure to build the long-promised Northern Powerhouse Rail, let alone the farce of HS2, and countless other similar failures and unmet promises across the country outside of London, has meant much of the country is lagging further and further behind London and the South East. The Treasury solution to this, unthinkingly adopted by Rachel Reeves, is to try and do even more in London and the South East, on the grounds that success breeds success. And so Labour has, like so many governments before, promised a third runway at Heathrow of limited real economic benefit, and to turn Oxford and Cambridge into a new Silicon Valley. If Burnham is serious about breaking with all this, then that's a very significant step away from the Starmer-Reeves approach of hugging those same failing Whitehall institutions ever more tightly. Burnham has made promises to create a number 10 of the North, to devolve more tax-raising powers to local authorities, to increase, quote, public control, if not pointedly public ownership, over water, energy and transport, and to push hard at delivering a massive expansion of council house building. All these have the potential to become serious and significant breaks with the failures of the past. But that's the problem. Burnham's speech could have been written at any point in the last 15 years since the financial crisis. It's a novelty to have someone this close to becoming Prime Minister speaking in this way about our economic failures, putting blame far closer to where it lies, with our failing institutions, rather than looking for scapegoats, whether immigrants or welfare claimants. And we should flag a caution here. Burnham is known to be keen on welfare reform. His new Chief of Staff, James Purnell, was Secretary of State for Welfare under Blair and zealously committed to cutting funding. The new Defence Investment Plan, announced this week, requires 1% funding cuts across government departments. The stage is set for some ugly politics. But Burnham's biggest problem is that this is 2026 and not 2016 or 2008. Borrowing costs for governments across the world have risen since the pandemic, and Britain's by more than most, reflecting those real economic weaknesses. Inflation has soared, creating an ongoing cost of living crisis that is only set to worsen as the Iran war and the impacts of El Niño play out, notably on food costs. The last week has seen, yet again, temperature records broken by a blistering heatwave. None of this, bar an interesting passing reference to the need for sovereignty in food production, was dealt with by Burnham. Where, for example, was his support for the essential demand of a national maximum working temperature? Our national politics are stuck in a world that is fast fading away. The problems Burnham will face when and if he becomes Prime Minister will not only be those of the last decade or even the last 4, they will be the new uncertainties of a climate-shocked and geopolitically unstable world, of sudden surges in the prices of food and other essentials, of the new costs and miseries of extreme weather, floods and heat waves, of supply chains for essential goods broken by wars. This new world is unforgiving of delay. Whatever plans our next Prime Minister might have for decades-long missions of national rewiring will be interrupted by repeated violent shocks and the growing public demands for protection against them. If there is a single lesson in the economics of the last 6 years, it is that the shock is no longer the exception, it has become the structure. And our third story this week looks at a new report from the Joseph Rowntree Foundation. The pandemic, the energy crisis that followed Russia's invasion of Ukraine, and now the war in Iran arrive not as discrete emergencies to be forgotten about rapidly, but as successive blows landing on households that have not recovered from the last. Last week's blistering heatwave is forecast to be followed next week by another, hopefully less dramatic one. The new Joseph Rowntree Foundation report looks at the impact of just one of those blows, the Iran war, and the closure of the Strait of Hormuz that gummed up world oil, gas and fertilizer supplies and sent costs of essentials spiralling upwards. The impacts on living standards, even without further shocks, are likely to be dramatic. Precisely because the underlying economy in the UK is so weak, official forecasts were already expecting household living standards to improve only very slightly this decade. Before the conflict in the Middle East began, Treasury forecasts implied that real average disposable incomes in the UK, measured after housing costs, would be 0.5% higher in 2029-30 than in 2024-25. That's around £230 a year. Once the strait was closed, the transmission from this shock to UK household budgets has been swift. UK wholesale gas prices rose by roughly 75% between late February and late March. Petrol climbed 14 pence a litre, diesel 29. Consumer price inflation, which had been expected to ease towards 2%, rose to 3.3% in March, with the Bank of England now anticipating it will sit between 3 and 3.5% through the middle of the year. In the last week, Ofgem, who regulate household energy prices, have announced a 13% increase in the typical household energy bill. Stack all this up, and again, even without future shocks or the expected impacts of El Niño, the Joseph Rowntree Foundation suggests the Iran war price impacts alone will leave the average household £740 a year worse off by the end of this decade. JRS policy prescription for this is to place economic security at the centre of the government's economic strategy, rather than treating it as an afterthought to be funded once growth arrives. The major parts of this would be an essentials guarantee, embedding a legal minimum below which support cannot fall, set by an independent calculation of the cost of essentials. Added to this would be an affordable energy guarantee, providing every household a portion of cheaper energy to cover basic use. But they also propose stronger protections in work against the personal disruptions of parenthood and sickness, amongst other measures. What this points to, correctly, is the need for a fundamental reform of our welfare system. It is, as all sides will agree, failing. But the challenge isn't trying to rinse a few more pennies out of the desperate. It's in building a system that can provide a genuinely universal safety net, sufficient for everyone, in a world where economic shocks are repeated and cumulative. Thank you for listening to today's show. Macrodose is a Planet B production. If you enjoyed the show and you'd recommend it to friends, please consider leaving us a rating and review wherever you get your podcasts. You can find all our episodes, including our bonus interview content, on our Patreon at patreon.com/macrodose.